For those who want to uncover history's darker mechanisms, stay to the end, subscribe, like, and tell us where you're watching from. On a winter night when the Bosphorus seemed a black tongue between continents, foreign dispatches recorded rumors that would not be easily forgotten. Men were thrown overboard, some said. Others spoke of coffers emptied and of a sultan who had begun to believe shadows. These reports, letters from Venetian envoys, reports carried by merchants to European capitals, arrived as fragments, halting and fearful. They would become part of a larger pattern, the archival evidence and whispered testimonies that, when assembled, expose how a private institution shaped public catastrophe. The harem, in histories told as exotic aside, was not merely domestic space or erotic fantasy. It was an engine. Built after the conquest of Constantinople and refined over generations, its architecture and personnel became tools in a political calculus. Birth, silence, and access determined who might touch the reins of power. Behind latticed windows and behind layers of protocol, policies were enforced with intimacies, pregnancies monitored as coordinate points, confidences traded for influence, and a bureaucracy of attendants and eunuchs that regulated information the way any state ministry would regulate grain or tax. Topkapi Palace itself gave language to the enclosure. Sailings along the Bosphorus delivered governors and grain, but also messages that never passed through the public court. Inside, corridors muffled sound, lattices allowed sight without exposure. The Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, occupied a place that was at once maternal and administrative. By law and custom, she could steward dynastic interests, raise candidates for succession, and broker appointments among the men who ruled outside the palace walls. In practice, that stewardship looked like coercion and negotiation with stakes as high as life. The chief eunuch, Kuzlar Aga, the lord of the girls, kept the keys. Eunuchs were not merely servants, they were gatekeepers whose bodies had been altered to fit the role the state required. Many were brought from diverse regions, the Balkans, the Caucasus, Crimea, sub-Saharan Africa, and inducted into an institutional caste that lived and governed the thresholds between the private and the public. A woman arriving at the palace would be stripped of name in the official sense and given a place in a hierarchy that rewarded fertility and punished disobedience. They learned quickly that silence had value. A whisper could sink a rival. A small favor could translate into an audience for a favored son. Pregnancy, an intimate fact, was politicized. News of a pregnancy moved through channels like a dispatch. It altered alliances, recalibrated patronage, and sometimes became the very currency by which a mother advanced her boy toward the throne. European chroniclers, often amazed and sometimes scandalized, recorded such mechanics as curiosity. Ottoman registers and palace records, when they survive, show the same logic embedded in routine administration. The Valide Sultan could be both protector and arbiter. In one reconstruction, preserved in rumor and diplomatic shorthand, a valide sits by a latticed window, fingers threaded through silk that gleams as if it were stitched from light. She speaks to the chief eunuch in a low voice that is equal parts command and plea. "Keep the prince away from that vizier," she says. "Do not let him see the state papers." The eunuch nods, knowing that a single misstep might topple fortunes. Such reconstructions cannot be read as transcripts, but they are plausible. Power in the palace operated through such private conversations, where the fate of the empire was decided in fragments and confidences. Silk recurs in the palace's symbol set for a reason. It drapes nobles and hides instruments, its sheen signifying status, even as its threads can as easily strangle. Silk appears on parade and at night in quieter, crueler moments. Water is the counterpart. The Bosphorus carries away what the palace cannot display. It erases and hides. Latticed windows mediate sight and concealment, allowing the world to be seen in slivers while insulating the palace's interior logic. And silence itself, often enforced, sometimes strategic, becomes the most effective instrument of governance. Those who knew too much or spoke too loudly were often silenced by exile, by removal from influence, or by more permanent means. Foreign observers recorded allegations of bodies in the water or of sudden disappearances. Ottoman officials managed what could be seen and what could not. Eunuchs were central to that regime of access. Their position granted them authority the state entrusted, but also rendered them dependent on the same system that had altered their bodies. They monitored the comings and goings, kept the keys to private apartments, and controlled which words reached the Sultan's ear. Contemporary accounts describe the Bashagasa, the head eunuch, as someone who could shape policy by choosing who stood in the Sultan's shadow. Neutral phrasing must be used when speaking of castration. It was an institutionally sanctioned practice, often performed in faraway slave markets or under conditions of trafficking that modern readers would rightly name as coercive. Historical sources, travelers' reports, administrative lists attest to the practice without the lurid detail. What matters for an understanding of power is that the bodies of eunuchs were altered to fit an administrative role, and that this bodily alteration conferred both status and vulnerability. The harem's internal discipline produced peculiar incentives. Mothers invested in their sons' futures with the tenacity of fiscal managers. Concubines became political agents because the only route to security lay through producing a recognized heir. Rivalries between mothers could erupt into factionalism in the palace that extended outward to the imperial administration. Viziers were appointed or dismissed on the grounds of palace intrigue. Military support shifted in response to rumors of succession. The Janissaries, an elite infantry corps formed from Christian boys taken by the Devshirme system and converted into Ottoman soldiers, were outside the harem but often responsive to its signals. When palace disorder intensified, the Janissaries could become the decisive public force, their intervention translating private crisis into public action. The anatomy of power made small decisions seismic. A favored concubine's promotion could displace a network of patrons. A rumor of pregnancy could trigger new alliances. European envoys sent careful letters home. "The Sultan's mind grows unsteady," wrote one, and couched this observation in anecdotes of extravagance and cruelty. Such dispatches must be handled critically. Envoys had political motives, but when compared with internal records and later accounts, a pattern emerges. The palace was a closed ecosystem that produces its own pathologies. Concentration of secrecy breeds abuses. Secrecy breeds markets for influence. Markets for influence incentivize deception. Within this ecosystem, certain figures stand out as structural exemplars. Kosem Sultan, one of the most powerful women in 17th century Ottoman politics, navigated motherhood, regency, and the shifting loyalties of courtiers and military men. Her life illustrates the paradox. To protect the dynasty, she sometimes became an architect of the very manipulations that endangered it. The chief eunuch served as her interlocutor and as the palace's operative, interpreting and enforcing the Valid's will. Sultan Ibrahim, whose reign would later be remembered for unpredictability and excess, moved through these channels like a man buffeted by currents he could not always see. His erratic decisions, some documented, some reported in rumor, intensified palace factionalism rather than resolving it. The system's logic allowed for small cruelties to scale. Punishments could be bureaucratic as much as physical. Demotions, sequestrations, and the withholding of audiences functioned as instruments of power. At times, the harem's internal punishments intersected with public violence. Accounts, both domestic and foreign, allege episodes where those deemed dangerous to the palace's order were removed from sight by means that left little archival trace. Water and silence did their work. Modern historians have debated the scale and exact nature of such actions. The documentary record is fragmentary. Yet, it is precisely those gaps that make the harem's politics so dangerous. Where official paperwork stops, rumor and enforced forgetting begin. As the institution matured, so did the stakes. A palace that once might have been an adjunct to governance became, in practice, a rival court. The lines between private manipulation and public policy blurred. And when crises emerged, crop failures, military setbacks, fiscal strain, the palace's internecine struggles did not abate. They intensified, because the rewards of controlling the Sultan increased while the tolerance for dissent decreased. What happens then when the central figure grows unpredictable? How does a system designed for secrecy cope with a sovereign who sees enemies everywhere? These questions would find a tragic answer in the turbulent mid-17th century. By then, the harem's procedures and personnel had calcified into an apparatus that could protect the dynasty in ordinary times and destroy it in extraordinary ones. The narrative of decline and eruption is not a single dramatic moment, but a cascade. Misrule begets factionalism. Factionalism begets military alarm. Military alarm begets intervention. The Janissaries, whose training and identity bound them to the state rather than to the palace's interior logic, could not stand permanently apart. When they marched in response to public outrage and institutional failure, they translated private palace rot into regime change. It is easy, at a distance, to reduce these events to personalities. Mad sultan, scheming mother, ruthless eunuch. That simplification is unfair and dangerous. What matters is the architecture, a system that concentrated access and obscured accountability. Decisions made behind latticed windows had consequences in provinces far away, where grain rotted or soldiers mutiny because a sultan's ear had been occupied by unreliable counsel. European letters that once reported on a single night's atrocity, bodies carried by the current, thus resonate differently when understood as symptoms of a structural failure. This is not a story designed to titillate. It is an investigation into how institutions normalize harm. The harem's very design, secrecy, patronage, control of reproduction and information, created perverse incentives that rewarded manipulation and punished transparency. Within that design, human beings made choices, some desperate, some calculated, and many coerced. Concubines were complicit in survival strategies not because they relished power, but because the system left few alternatives. And yet, the harem is not only a cautionary tale of abuse. It is also a place of constrained agency, where women learned to navigate, to protect children, to house ambitions under veils. The Valid Sultan could be a guardian as well as an operator. Eunuchs could be humane stewards as well as enforcers. These contradictions make the history both morally complex and painfully modern. Systems produce actors who are neither wholly villain nor wholly victim. As the narrative turns toward the reign that cracked the facade, the reign of a sultan whose excess and suspicion eroded the last pretense of order, one must consider the instruments at play. Silk and water and silence had been used for generations. Now they would be enlisted in a struggle whose outcome would reach beyond the palace to strike at the Ottoman polity itself. The question that presses forward is not merely what individual cruelty occurred, but how a political machinery of intimacy becomes the engine of public disaster. In the next moments, the palace's private workings would collide with the city's discontent, and the janissaries would step from barracks into the space the harem thought beyond reach. When the janissaries did finally march, they did not come as a thunderbolt, but as the accumulated weight of grievance. Pay had been late for months. Provincial tax farms bled the provinces dry. The markets of the capital, once supplied by caravans and granaries, tightened under administrative neglect. The street sellers who had once murmured about price and spoilage now spoke openly of a palace that spent more on festal perfumes and new retinue than on the soldiers who kept the roads open. Rumor, which had been the harem's companion, turned outward and became accusation. The night the troops entered the outer courts, lanterns bobbed in a city made thin by fear and hunger. The commanders who led them were not men eager to topple dynasties for principle. They were officers whose men had families to feed, whose accounts had been hollowed by embezzlement, and whose honor had been insulted by rumors of the Sultan's caprice. Their movement into the palace was a translation of public despair into a military act. Once inside the gates, they found traces of the harem's rule writ large and small. Rooms strewn with gifts whose origin could not be readily explained. Lists, some scorched, of appointments and stipends. Corridors where eunuchs still kept watch, eyes wide with the shock of being discovered. Ibrahim himself, once a child of the palace and then its undoing, was not the mad sultan only by private vice. He had spent the treasury on entertainments and had turned suspicion into a policy. Men who once held office were stripped, banished, or executed on whispers. The mechanisms of punishment, dismissal, exile, strangling, had been refined to leave no public ledger, only absence and silence. When the soldiers reached the inner apartments and demanded audience, the hearings took the form of a private justice gone public. The Sultan was removed from power with little ceremony. His removal was both the undoing of a person and the collapse of the palace's capacity to contain violence within its latticework of secrecy. The final act, his death at the hands of those who had been given the means to execute without throwing the state into disorder, was a grim logic. When a system that hides its operations meets a disciplined, armed public, the result is spectacle and rupture. But the removal of one ruler did not heal the deeper dysfunction. In the vacuum that followed, the harem's internal rivalries intensified until they overflowed into the corridors of governance. Kosum Sultan, who had long exercised influence as mother and counselor, moved to secure a childhood claimant to the throne. Turhan, the younger consort and mother of the new boy sultan, resisted. The struggle between them was fought with the same instruments that had long fashioned palace power: The allegiance of eunuchs, the placement of favorites at the gate, the orchestration of public perceptions through discreet gifts and whispered confidences. Yet now those instruments were less reliable. The Janissaries had demonstrated that force could reach even the inner sanctum. Provincial governors had learned that the capital could no longer insulate itself from unrest. What had once served as a means of survival, discretion, manipulation, control of succession, had become fragile and contested. The murder of Kosum, when it came, was a turning point that many contemporaries perceived as the ceiling of a new age. She had ruled through influence for decades, seen sons and grandsons sit upon the throne, and in her last years had been the fulcrum of state decisions. Her end, violently executed in the palace precincts, according to those who recorded the event, was both an act of personal enmity and a symptom of institutional collapse. When one faction moved to remove another by blood, the norms that had permitted palace rulership to remain quasi-separate from the life of the realm were shattered. Regencies became battlefields. The figure of the child sultan, once a placeholder around whom elders could gather, now symbolized the incapacity of the state to channel succession without violence. From then on, patterns hardened. Short reigns multiplied. The office of Grand Vizier fluctuated between temporary authority and sacrificial scapegoat. The Janissaries discovered that they could influence outcomes. Provincial military leaders discovered that they could press their demands with threat rather than petition. Bureaucratic competence, which depends on steady appointment and the expectation of impartial adjudication, suffered. Factions that had learned to thrive in the hush of the harem, eunuchs, wet nurses, confidants, now competed more openly for spoils, while men with military backing converted their immediate leverage into political authority. The result was a governance in which decision-making shifted away from coherent administration toward the arithmetic of alliance and coercion. The fiscal consequences were immediate and corrosive. The treasury, strained by previous extravagance and now forced to meet the demands of soldiers and apparitors alike, resorted to short-term expedients, debased coin, increased tax farming, and arrears to suppliers. Markets reacted not only to the shortage of coin, but to the loss of confidence in a state that might not be able to honor contracts. Provincial notables who paid taxes through intermediaries grew skittish. Some withheld levies, others carved out greater autonomy. The Ottoman polity had always balanced center and periphery through a mixture of administrative insertion and local accommodation. Once the center's signals, appointments from the capital, the dispersal of stipends, the enforcement of law, became erratic, local actors filled the void. In the culture of governance, too, the harem's legacy endured. The methods of influence, marriage, patronage, access to the sovereign remained salient, but they were refracted through a new lens. Now, those who sought to shape policy had to secure not only the sovereign's ear, but also the support of armed men and the acquiescence of the palace's administrative cadres. Power ceased to be merely intimate and became often transactional and force-backed. The older justificatory narratives that the palace's privacy shielded the dynasty from the rougher politics of the bazaar and barracks were shredded. Public crises that had once been contained by the harem's internal resolutions now required broader coalitions to address. Absent those coalitions, violence was the default. Yet, even in this period of unraveling, there were continuities that complicate a narrative of simple decline. The harem's women continued to manage estates, distribute alms, and patronize foundations. Wet nurses raised children who would become governors and men of letters. Endowments founded in an earlier age still sustained soups and schools in the city's poorer quarters. Eunuchs' duties, who were humane, continued to perform duties that kept palace life from dissolving into pure factionalism. In other words, the institutions did not wholly perish. They transformed, their shadows long over the public life, shaping patterns of patronage and expectation long after the decisive deeds were done. If one searches for the moral in this cascade, it is not the simple dictum that secrecy is evil or power corrupts. Rather, the lesson lies in the architecture of relations. A polity that concentrates influence within private, unaccountable spheres invites the growth of systems whose internal logic can, under stress, become inimical to the polity they once sustained. The harem's design, control of access, management of reproduction, mastery of intimate counsel, solved problems for generations. But when the outward demands on statecraft intensified, war, famine, fiscal strain, the very mechanisms that had allowed dynastic continuity impeded responsive governance. What had been a reservoir of statecraft became a blockage. The eruption of the mid-century, then, is to be read not as the fall of a single palace, but as the manifestation of a structural tension between intimacy and accountability. When gardens, lattices, and whispered lists determine who receives the state's favors, those outside the lattice will sooner or later test its walls. Sometimes the test takes the form of petition. Sometimes it takes the form of the soldier with a drawn sword. The janissaries who marched were not merely avengers of unpaid wages. They were actors compelled by a system that had narrowed the channels of legitimate redress. In the years that followed, the city adjusted. The great domes continued to bear their shadows. Ships kept arriving at the Golden Horn. Scholars argued in the coffee houses about what must be reformed. But the veneer of palace invulnerability had been fractured. The harem remained a center of influence, but its edges were ragged and penetrable. New patterns of power, military patrons, provincial magnates, and an increasingly transactional court would define the polity's politics for decades to come. The consequences would not all be immediate or dramatic in the manner of a single night's tragedy. They would settle into practices, shorter reigns, recurrent military interventions, and a rule of access over merit. The palace's inner life, its silk, its water, its enforced forgettings, would continue to produce choices both humane and cruel. Yet, the mid-century rupture showed how even the most private institutions are implicated in the fate of the realm. What had been intended as a safeguard against turbulence had become, under certain conditions, a catalyst for it. The harem's lessons were therefore double-edged, an object lesson in human adaptability, and a warning about the dangers of insulating power from public account. Outside the palace, the city moved on. Merchants reopened ledgers. Apprentices learned their trades. The call to prayer rose and fell as it always had. Inside the palace, however, the calculus of survival had been altered. New alignments were being drawn. New patrons sought to place their people at the gates. Children were groomed with an awareness that the throne might be both prize and peril. The lattice had not collapsed entirely, but its pattern had been remade by the force that had breached it. The harem's history, long shaped by secrecy and subtlety, had, in that mid-century moment, showed how the private machinery of rule can become indistinguishable from the public machinery of ruin. Men who had learned to read the arcs of patronage like the weather, learned to read clouds, what stations would darken, where rain might fall, began to act on that knowledge. A sultan's favor, once thought near divine in its caprice, was now a commodity to be hedged against. A vizier might purchase a district's loyalty with a marriage, a loan, a promise to appoint a man whose voice could be called at court. The household that had been the locus of intimate counsel made room, unwillingly, for a new arithmetic. How many soldiers could a single household feed in winter? How many shiploads of grain would answer a season of bad weather? Where the lattice had once insulated the machinery of rule, its openings now admitted calculation and barter. The court became more transactional, not because its players were newly venal, but because the stakes had shifted, and the old currencies, birth, silence, ritual, no longer paid the debts the state incurred. Outside the palace walls, the change was felt in different registers. Provincial magnates, men who had risen by the sword or by shrewd collection of taxes, began to take on functions formerly monopolized in the capital. They founded endowments and schools, built caravanserais, and bound local notables to them by marriage and by office. The wakfas, established by princesses and grandees in earlier generations, continued to supply bread and medical care. Their revenues, invested in land near bazaars and ports, made it possible for merchants to carry on when central coffers faltered. These foundations, paradoxically, preserved a public good even as they extended private influence. The same legal device that allowed a household to secure social esteem allowed it to entrench a local power. The janissary and the ion, soldiers and provincial lords, did not march only for pay or grievance. They moved because the channels for redress and recognition had been contracted. A petition that once might have found its way through a wet nurse to a princess to the throne now faced a wall of middlemen, secretaries, eunuchs, a vizier whose own position depended upon the same lattice. When petitions failed, force spoke. Yet force, too, became a language of bargaining. Barracks and provincial retinues would negotiate for governorships, for contracts, for exemptions. The line between protector and predator blurred. To be a patron meant to be a client in other eyes. Within the palace, adaptation took subtler forms. Women of the harem who retained influence used the familiar instruments of marriage and gift to secure new kinds of alliances. Daughters were no longer always married to distant governors for reasons of alliance alone. Sometimes they were married to secure a fiscal backer, to anchor an estate that would supply grain to the capital in hard years. Wet nurses, once anonymous figures of domestic tenderness, became stepping stones of careerism. A nurtured child who rose to command a regiment might remember the woman who fed him and place her nephew at a port's customs house. Eunuchs, whose power was tied to proximity, learned to cultivate patrons beyond the palace sanctum. Merchants who needed protection for a convoy, clerics who wished to place a school under the aegis of a sympathetic patron. The harem's instruments were redeployed, not abandoned. A cultura de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Anne's instruments were redeployed, not abandoned. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Fim das instruções. Então, the cultural imagination adjusted to these new arrangements with a mixture of satire and nostalgia. Poets in the coffee houses wrote verses that both praised and mocked the modest, sub-rosa empires of the women within the palace. Playwrights staged scenes of merchants brokering favors with handmaidens. Chroniclers recorded, with a new minuteness, the lists of endowments and the bequests of princely widows. Histories that once celebrated the Sultan's solitary grandeur began to note lines of influence that ran like tributaries to the public river. Mothers, wet nurses, eunuchs, and local lords. The city's public conversation, heated, speculative, sometimes conspiratorial, turned upon questions of merit and access. Who could be trusted to decide? Who ought to be tested by the sword? And who by speech? Materially, the apparatus of governance altered as well. Shorter reigns meant sacks of papers left unfinished on ministers' desks. New viziers arrived to find they could not quickly untangle the debts and the patronage of their predecessors. Officials learned to protect themselves not only by fidelity to the throne, but by cultivating a network of patrons and protégés who would hold positions when fortunes changed. The bureaucracy warped into a palimpsest of claims. An order signed by one minister might be countermanded by another. A grant of land might carry more than one title, and the litigant who came to court seeking redress sometimes found that the judges themselves were beneficiaries of the same grants. And yet the machinery that performed the state's ordinary functions didn't stop. Ships still unloaded pepper and wool at the Golden Horn. The Qadi issued verdicts in the market. Students read in the madrasas. The city's rhythms, prayer, market, festival, outlasted policy and palace intrigue. In such continuities lay a kind of stubborn publicness. The harem's influence had been one among many things that made the polity run. Its weakening or transformation did not produce immediate collapse, but it did make the route by which grievances could be longer and more uncertain. That uncertainty would, in time, be felt as a decline in confidence, a costly phenomenon not immediately visible in ledgers. Personal stories threaded these structural shifts. A wet nurse turned matron who had once instructed a future governor in the grammar of household governance found herself petitioned not only for counsel but for funds to buy grain when a drought stalked the countryside. She understood how the old mechanisms of persuasion, gifts, supplications, ritual observance worked, and she used them. But she discovered, with unease, that those mechanisms could only go so far against a treasury strained by war and fickle taxes.
A eunuchi, who had once served as the bridge between a princess and a sultan, lived long enough to see a nephew's appointment overturned by a captain who offered the sultan troops at a cheaper rate. The eunuch's grief was not only personal, but institutional. The role he had embodied no longer fit the polity's urgent needs. The children raised beneath the lattice absorbed these lessons as tacit knowledge. Boys and girls learned to count favors as easily as beads. How many suppers to offer, which person to meet at the evening prayer, when to write to a creditor, and when to ask for mercy. Schools taught them letters and theology. Their mothers taught them that power was never purely ceremonial. Parents groomed sons for courts that might be merciful or perilous. Daughters were prepared for marriages that could bind them to a province or subject them to the vagaries of a vizier's tastes. The intimate education of the household became a form of political apprenticeship, a curriculum delivered in whispers, in the handling of money, in the careful giving of praise. Memory preserved certain truths in ways that policy did not. Even men who resented the harem's secrecy retained a private admiration for its efficiency in knifing through the snarls of formal protocol. Men who profited from the new transactional order could be heard in quieter moments to recall the hidden calendars of devotion and charity that had once kept the capital from sinking into want. Thus, the harem's legacy remained ambivalent, both a symptom to be corrected and a resource to be tapped. Reformers who sought to make the state more transparent therefore faced a paradox: to strip away secrecy without tearing the fabric of obligations that, for all their faults, channeled wealth toward schools, soup kitchens, and hospitals. As decades turned, the palace's domes kept their shadows, but the shapes of those shadows altered. New patrons arrived at the gates, carrying petitions in their pockets and the weight of provincial retinues at their backs. The lattice, frayed, rewoven, patched, allowed different goods to pass than it had a century before. The polity learned, the hard way, that institutions hardened by custom resist sudden remolding. The mid-century rupture did not erase the habits that had been cultivated there. It redirected them. In time, historians and poets, merchants and judges would debate whether the change had been a necessary adaptation or the prelude to deeper decline. For those living through it, there was less appetite for such abstractions and more for practical questions. Where would the next grain come from? Who would command the loyalty of the troops? Which household could be trusted to discharge an endowment when famine approached? In the harem's inner courtyard, on an autumn morning after a night of rain, an old woman sat by a shallow pool. The fountains had been cleaned that week. The sound of water, small and constant, steadied the air.